How can you navigate divorce with your head, not just your heart? Joining us today, we've got Byron James, family lawyer, expat law, and psychologist Charlotte Spurway. And together, they're going to help us understand some of the emotional traps of divorce, how to make some clearer decisions, and what really does matter.
Ultimately, divorce proceedings very much are ruled by our nervous system response. And this is kind of an unconscious threat response that we go through, where we either go into anger or we go into rage, or we're flooded by grief, or we're flooded just by the sadness and the upset. And whether we want to go into kind of fight response, or whether we want to kind of freeze down, or we're really struggling with those emotions and we kind of shut down and can't really do much. So the emotional response really ends up navigating how somebody wants to move forward or proceed.
And Byron, then from a legal perspective, how have you seen heightened emotions impact the divorce process, and can it lead to poor decision making?
So I think divorce is a funny thing. It's about extremes for me. I don't think anyone has an average divorce. I think I'm quite positive about it in that it's a new beginning. And so I think for a lot of people going through divorce, it's not just necessarily the worst time of their life. Sometimes it's about a new beginning and about embracing change. But also for other people, they've just been through a huge trauma and they're really struggling to come to terms with changes to their life that may have been in place for decades. And so it is about extremes, and it's about understanding that for everyone, it's a unique thing. It's a bespoke point. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all for divorce. It affects people differently.
And what have you seen in terms of examples where you thought, oh, crikey, we need to get Charlotte in here before there's lashing out or there's retreating, or are you going to look back and go, gosh, I really didn't have my head screwed on then?
Well, one thing I'm definitely not is as qualified as Charlotte to deal with these things. And so I'm a great believer in people utilising services like that in the process so that they understand what I can assist them with and what someone who is more qualified to deal with the emotional side of things can deal with. Because it's understandable that people look at their lawyer and think, well, they're helping me with these problems. Maybe they can help me with everything. And of course, for lawyers, we have to be very clear about what we are able or not able to deal with. And ultimately what we're doing is we're helping people through the process to get to an outcome, whether that's relating to children, finances, or just getting them divorced. Whereas for someone like Charlotte, they're trying to help them, I imagine, build themselves up and to be really positive about what's happening and dealing with it in a healthy way.
Charlotte, you said there about, the fight, flight, freeze, and there's the fawn response as well. How do you think these show up in divorce? And ultimately, how can someone have the wherewithal to realise where they are, what state they're in?
Yeah, so I have clients who come to me at various stages of a divorce proceedings, and right at the very beginning, people can be in, a really flooded state, right? So the two extremes are, I'm so angry, there's so much rage, I'm betrayed, okay? And this is where they feel so powerful in the moment with that anger, and it's almost it's a face for something bigger and more painful underneath.
Well, I keep on hearing this phrase, which is, anger is a secondary emotion. Can you unpack that a little bit in this context?
Yeah, I mean, if we're really in pain, right, we're suffering, deep down, we probably don't want to be seen as weak, or we probably don't want to be seen as a failure. So to kind of cover it up, typically we can go into anger where we go, oh my goodness, my ego is going to come out. I don't want anyone to perceive me as weak. So possibly within these divorce proceedings, I'm going to go after them and take them for everything they've got, because I don't want to be seen by the public as public humiliation, maybe a smear campaign, whatever it might be. I don't want to be seen as weak.
So does the ego come into play there, this idea of winning a divorce?
Yeah, of course. And lots of people don't want to be labelled as a divorcee either. That comes into play with more of my clients who I would say are on the kind of sadness, upset, flooded with grief, where, they're in that kind of cognitive overload state and they just can't think straight or make decisions. Whereas I would say when it does go down to more anger and kind of conflict-esque, which some clients go that way, of course ego is to play there. Because they don't want to lose, they don't want to fail or be perceived as that.
So Byron, then to your mind, what are some of the biggest legal mistakes that people make when emotions do take over?
I think there's a lot of projection. So you'll find, I'll give you an example, child arrangements. So people can be quite difficult about child arrangements when you'd think they'd be quite straightforward, or in the end you could take it from the perspective that a child needs both parents and let's just be reasonable. But as soon as things like new partners come on the scene, or Social media is obviously a big one, which can trigger people where they see them living a very happy life and they aren't happy about them moving on. Child arrangements can often be the one thing left that you have control over, that you can still try and use that to cause a problem.
Charlotte, I just wanted to ask you this. How do you advise that someone does step back from emotional reactivity and make clearer, more rational decisions? How do you work with people and how do you start to broach that perhaps they are reacting rather than responding?
Yeah, great question. And I think the biggest one is to kind of understand the narratives that, I call it the gremlin, that your gremlin's telling you. Because most of the time, the stories that we have in our head about our ex or ourselves, about our self-worth or our self-esteem, are normally not true. And the gremlin has kind of created this perceived kind of reality that's just not true.
What are some of the gremlins that you've heard from clients in the past?
Oh, I don't know. I've failed. I'm not good enough. There must be something wrong with me. I'm unlovable. This gremlin can take us to really painful stories, or we can start being quite abusive and saying things about our ex-partner, whether that's our ex, husband or wife, about what they've done or who they are. And what we ultimately do is take them off a pedestal in a way to kind of berate them in our anger or our anguish, so that we don't see them as wonderful as we used to.
And it must be one thing to tell yourself some of these stories, but when you start telling other people, that must be even more poisonous.
Yeah, so really it's a coping strategy, right? Like, we need to get out of this perceived feeling of threat, or that we're vulnerable, and this threat of possibly being alone, this threat of financial instability, this threat of losing a marriage, and what that encompasses, ultimately makes us act emotionally.
You guys are working together, so Byron, I wanted to ask you that, when emotions do drive the legal process, how do you then as a lawyer help clients refocus on what truly matters? Because you are there as a voice of reason in so many ways.
So I think the key is about the environment in which people are making decisions. So you want to make sure that they've got space, that they're not under pressure. So a big thing for some people when you're getting divorced is maybe they have to change house. They're worried about how they're going to pay for the school fees, or how much money they're going to have this month. So what I like to do at the start of all cases is to do securing the interim, to make sure that people are in a space that they are as happy as they can be, so that when they're making some of the most important decisions of their life, they're not under other pressures. But then, of course, a big part of it as well is making sure they have the right support network around them.
Right, let's go to the text line. And many of these messages are anonymous, and that is absolutely fine. Anonymous saying, thank you all. I'm struggling with a very difficult situation in that my husband wants a divorce, but I don't. We've been married for a long time. He's unhappy with how things have turned out and has asked for a divorce. I don't want one for several reasons. I do still have feelings for him. I'm not interested in anyone else. I think it would cause financial hardship for us both and negatively impact the children. And I don't believe it would make either of us happy in the long run. However, he's been focused on settling financial matters as a step forward. It feels like money is his main concern. He's shown no real willingness to work on our relationship. I don't know what to do next. Should I insist on couples therapy or counselling? Should I consult a divorce lawyer on my own? Charlotte, do you want to kick off with this one?
Yeah, I would say it's a complicated answer, but if he is definitely not wanting to work, there's not even an ounce that he wants to do that, then unfortunately there's not much you can do apart from find your own emotional kind of safety, learn to kind of regulate your nervous system, and as you said, get those emotions into that regulated stance so that you can act more logically moving forward. And I know it's really, really painful. And find that environment, find that community, maybe get yourself a therapist where you can kind of work through the emotions of this sense of loss and what this might mean for you.
And then, Byron, what does happen in the UAE if only one party wants a divorce?
So just as well, just pick up on that, but definitely take legal advice. So whenever you're in a situation where divorce may or may not be relevant, you should always take legal advice to understand your position more clearly. Just wanted to get that in. But the position in the UAE is, obviously you have the law that applies to people here and also in their home countries as well. So for most countries around the world that are Western, you'll find that you have no fault divorce. And that means that sadly, if one person wants to get divorced, then they usually can.
So, and I don't know anything about this particular case, but I'm just trying to extrapolate and understand a little bit more. So let's say you do have a couple that lives together and one person says the other, I want a divorce, the other person goes, no, and I'm not moving out. What happens next?
Well, then you're subjecting yourself to the legal process, I guess, and you have to go through it against their wishes. But here in the UAE, you can still get divorced if the other person doesn't consent, if you're non-Muslim, or if you're a foreigner and you're in Abu Dhabi.
Okay.
So the only people who need to prove fault on a divorce are locals and Muslims in the personal status court.
Okay.
And so in those scenarios, you have to prove that somebody's behaved in such a way that you couldn't be reasonably expected to stay married to them.
I wanted to ask about the parental side. You know, we talk time and time again, and rightly so, about having a child-centric divorce. And I wondered, Byron, you know, what have you seen before when you just think you're not thinking about the children at all?
Well, I have to be careful because I always fight my client's corner, and I always take their side. But I do think that the ones where I think it's really obvious is when it really goes on for a long time and there are repeated issues. And I think at that point, people have to ask themselves, what's this really about? Because for children, they don't want to be subject to legal proceedings, really. As a rule, some do, in the sense that they want to have their voice heard, and maybe if they're unhappy, they want to have a change. But you're talking really about teenagers there. For when children are subject to proceedings for a long time, that is almost always a bad thing.
And Charlotte, then for parents going through divorce, how can they manage their own emotions without, well, you know, pouring poison into the ear of children, or indeed not being able to support their own children emotionally?
Yeah, I would definitely say if you can get yourself a therapist where you can unpack what you're really feeling, because as soon as we've been able to go into that deep dive and gone down to the root, we can start going, okay, that's your aha moment. And do I actually need to be responding in this way? Am I responding for the well-being of myself and my children, or actually am I here to kind of just get one over?
And presumably it would be very tempting. I think we all like to think that we'd be very, you know, emotionless and calm about it. It'd be very natural if you are feeling hurt, upset, if there has been infidelity, or that, you know, you don't want a divorce, to have your children as, you know, accidental sounding boards for whatever you're going through, which is not their role. That's not what a child is
and we should
there for.
never get our children to parent us too early, because that leads to more kind of psychological kind of traumas or issues later on down the line if they're adulting far too young.
Let's get the text line, because I have a message here from G saying, I know it's going to vary quite a bit, but I wondered if you could give me a rough idea of how long a divorce can take to go through in the UAE, and a rough idea of cost. Also, if there's a house that's jointly owned, when do you put it for sale? Is it during the divorce process or after it's been finalised? So, Byron, what would you say to G?
So the length of time of the proceedings depends on where you're getting divorced. In Abu Dhabi, the civil family court, you're divorced in 30 days. Whereas in Dubai, for Muslims, there's a slightly longer process. And for non-Muslims, there's the no-fault process. There, you're looking at more like 6 months. And then abroad, it can be a lot longer. So, for example, in India, average is 10 years for a divorce.
Wow.
That's one of the longest in the world.
Why?
England, you're looking at probably 1 year is average, is par.
Why?
Well, look, so the things with divorce proceedings, there's a lot to sort out. And for some countries which are more focused on proving behaviour, then that can take a long time. And then you can have witnesses and all kinds of things. But Abu Dhabi leads the world at the moment. It's the third fastest country in the world for a divorce.
Do you think getting divorced should be made easier or harder, Byron?
I think it's a great question. And I think it depends on who you are. I'll give you two examples. For the person who's ready to move on and they want to embrace the next chapter of their life, they want it done as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. For someone who has been married for 25 years and just found out that their partner's had an affair and they were perfectly happy, for them getting divorced very quickly can seem like an added problem. But suddenly everything's changed and they can be made to feel that they're completely powerless, and that isn't a good thing to feel in divorce.
So that idea of kind of recalibration, because we do hear about this an awful lot when a couple is perhaps coming to this at maybe not at different times, but certainly at different levels of acceptance and understanding. There might be someone who has mentally checked out of that divorce years before their partner's even been told about it. And this idea of, if you say this kind of loss of self, Charlotte, must be really, really challenging to not act out of hurt and grief.
Yeah, I mean, if you've just had the rug pulled from under you and you were completely happy, you didn't see this coming, you know, it can be very, very difficult to work through. And maybe you're so emotionally overwhelmed and flooded that your amygdala, part of your brain, basically is hijacking your prefrontal cortex, and you just can't think straight. And whether that's, you know, you catch yourself screaming in the car or you're uncontrollably crying, when we're in that extreme state, how on earth can we access that logical part of our brain to then go down and make rational decisions in a divorce proceedings. We can't. It's hard.
Anonymous asking on 4001, please can Byron explain what impact a divorce due to unreasonable behaviour might have? What is a no-fault divorce? I plan to divorce my husband due to unreasonable behaviour. There's been emotional abuse, verbal abuse, coercion. Does this mean we have to go through court? What do the reasons for divorce mean, and what impact could they have financially? I want a quiet divorce as quickly as possible.
So these days there are two types of divorce, and as I say, both of them apply in the UAE, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim. A no-fault divorce is where you don't have to give a reason why you want to get divorced. You just have to say you want to be divorced. So for that applies in Abu Dhabi, the Civil Family Court, and to non-Muslims here in Dubai. Mm-hmm. And internationally, you'll find that most Western courts apply a no-fault standard. For unreasonable behaviour, that's a legal phrase, and that's where you want to prove that somebody's behaved in such a way it would be unreasonable for you to be expected to stay married to them. And look, I think that's a little bit old-fashioned, but there are religious reasons why it exists. And for some people, it's important that you have a reason to get divorced. But actually, on balance, I think as Charlotte said earlier, when you're in a situation where one person really does want to get divorced, you may think the utility of making the process difficult just so they have to stay together isn't really serving the purpose you think it is.
Message here saying, if I get divorced, could I still be eligible for a visa from my partner? That's my concern in the UAE, the visa.
So there is a divorce spouse visa that exists for 1 year after the divorce. So that is available for you. So look into that. And that gives you a period of time to then recalibrate and work out how you're going to work out your visa thereafter. I will say these days it's much easier to get a visa than it was, 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago.
Okay.
So it should be fine.
Hope that helps. And lastly, Charlotte, once that legal process is quote unquote over, what steps do you think someone can take to emotionally rebuild and move forward when they're ready?
Yeah, I definitely think if you're that person trying to hold on to your ex-partner, you've got to really think about, if I continue to hold on to this, how much is my anxiety going to be affected, and how much is my self-esteem? Because you're just going to increase your own suffering by holding on to that. And if listeners want it, I do have a kind of a free survival kit guide to help people through kind of 10 steps if they want that. But mainly, rebuild relationships with your close friends, rebuild your relationships with your family, always have a level of movement. And we want to be trying to do deep breathing practices where we can kind of regulate our nervous system, as well as talking therapy.
If that's something that sounds useful, send me the word link. I'll take that from Charlotte and can send that your way, your kind of survival guide. Message here saying, I see children being affected, but how can you explain to parents to avoid pouring poison into children's ears? I heard about one lady refusing to get married as she's scared she'll face infidelity like her dad did. That generational trauma, and I guess the stories we tell ourselves after hearing about painful marriages.
I think the biggest thing with this one is, imagine what kind of parent you want to be or be reported back to you by your own child when they're like 18 or 21, because we will move through this process, and it's about, how do you want your dignity, and how do you want to come across? What would you want your own children to say about you later on in life about how you dealt with this?
That's a good question for any situation, I think, a lot of the time. Byron, lastly to you, for anyone listening who might be about to start the divorce process, what's the best mindset to your mind that they can adopt to get the best outcome, however you might deem that best to be?
I think it's calmness, because you're really making some of the biggest decisions you're ever going to make in your life, really, when it comes down to finances. And the sort of house you're going to live in, the sort of budget you're going to have to live off, whether it's possible to carry on living in the UAE. And so you want to be as calm as you can and as supported as you can, so you make good decisions.
Thank you both so much.